I want to be careful not to feed the trolls here, but there have been some pretty horrendous takes from the national media on Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears lately that, unfortunately, we just have to address.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On the show today, unfortunately, we have to talk about bad national media Bears takes and some bigger fish than others here. And I started out with one, I was like, okay, this is stupid. Whatever, move on with our lives. And then the second one, I'm like, God, this is getting annoying. And now that there's been three, I'm like, okay, let's address this, right? We need to slam the brakes a little bit here and get everything back under control here and address where the reality is that we seem to be distancing ourselves from. So we'll talk about three sort of distinct things that are along the same lines with Fields and the Bears, a particular Sports Illustrated piece about Justin Fields would be justified in asking for a trade. We had Mike Florio from Pro Football Talk talking about how he thinks maybe what his theory that the Bears don't believe in Justin Fields because they're not building around him, for apparently in his eyes. And then finally a third group that clearly just wants attention, and so I'm going to do my best not to name them and give them the full attention that they want, but there's a particular individual that was trying to feud sort of with Fields and Bears fans and tried to sort of throw him under the bus, and he comes from an organization that is reprehensible in many, many ways, and we should at least sort of set the record straight on some of the accusations and name-calling that we were getting about this Bears quarterback. But let's start with the Sports Illustrated piece from Connor Orr, because first and foremost, I don't have anything against Connor Orr himself. I mean, I've loosely met him. We've covered he was at the Senior Bowl. We've been in the same room. I haven't gotten to know him by any means, but I've been around the guy, and he's not a bad guy. He's not, he's not intentionally trying to harvest clicks or anything. I think he's just trying to think different ways about the way the Bears are building around Justin Fields. And so the article was sort of making the point that he thinks the NFL could use some sort of transfer portal, because the larger point being that it's not fair for Justin Fields to have to go through the rebuild that the Chicago Bears are going through, and that his argument, as we'll kind of get into, is that it's not good for Fields, that he should be able to sort of go elsewhere until the team is ready for a quarterback, apparently. And that's where some of the logic falls apart a little bit for me. And that's, again, we're going to sort of attack the ideas here a little, not attack, but we're going to sort of critique the ideas here, not so much the person, Connor Orr, who's otherwise, I think, a smart and good football guy. But to kind of go through the piece here, the opening line was, through no fault of his own and really through no fault of his current coach or general manager, Justin Fields is going to take snaps under center in 2022, surrounded by what is, on paper, one of the NFL's worst rosters. Basically deems it an impossible situation for Justin Fields to succeed. And so then he asks sort of, why can't Fields leave then if he's going to be harmed by this rebuilding process that the team is going through? And he compares it to the New York Jets with Zach Wilson. They tried to trade for Tyreek Hill. I mean, they didn't. And so it's not like Zach Wilson has a super supporting cast anyway. But regardless, it was more of an effort, more of a visible effort there. Or, of course, the Bengals building around Joe Burrow. Or he pointed out how the Jaguars with Trevor Lawrence have spent just tons and tons and tons of free agent dollars to try and get better pieces around him. And he kind of acknowledges, that it's not Ryan Poles' fault specifically. He even said, this rebuild is necessary and, a good thing for the Chicago Bears, but just not a good thing for Justin Fields specifically. And kind of points out that, hey, if the Bears were to trade Justin Fields, they could get draft picks for him and accelerate the rebuild and maybe get a better team. And most of that on its surface, right? I mean, there's some logic there. It kind of makes sense at first, but I just feel like when you sit and think about it a little bit more, it just doesn't quite add up perfectly for me. That if Justin Fields could leave the Bears via like a transfer portal or whatever, and say left the Bears, then of course they would need to draft another quarterback, presumably. But then that young quarterback would just be in the same position Justin Fields would be in. So does that young quarterback then get to leave too? Like you just, so then are you just not then allowed to have a promising young quarterback until you've built your team up good enough? Because it's kind of hard to build the team up if you don't have at least like the promise of quarterback hope, growth, development, like with like either Fields to be that young guy that players want to come play with, or having an established quarterback that players want to come play with. But if they're coming there knowing that you have a terrible quarterback because the good quarterbacks just leave because of this sort of hypothetical transfer portal, it would seem very, very difficult then to build up the roster. I also think it's a little bit presumptuous to assume that Justin Fields is going to be like drastically hurt by this rebuild. I would agree in the sense that like it's not fair. I mean, like ideally, yes, you would want to put a better supporting cast around Fields than they currently do have, which, by the way, they're not done putting that supporting cast around Fields. It's not going to be stellar, but like we all understand this is not going to be a great season this year. But I don't know that is that we don't know for sure that that's going to be just like devastating for Fields and his career, right? Like in the article, Connor points out that like, most quarterbacks, unless they're like the extreme greatest of all time levels, like they don't overcome terrible situations. Like most of the good quarterbacks also end up having good wide receivers and good supporting casts because that's part of what is able to make them good. But and I guess I think that's true in the sort of in the right now sense that no, like Justin Fields is not going to throw for 5,000 yards if he has a terrible supporting cast. But I do think the terrible supporting cast, even if it ends up being terrible or however you want to describe it, doesn't mean he's like never going to become good. As the supporting cast gets better, Fields could get better. Like plenty of quarterbacks are drafted into terrible teams and terrible situations because it's the terrible teams that get to draft quarterbacks early. But then, of course, like the quarterback gets better as the situation around him gets better. And then, lo and behold, those quarterbacks were not ruined by being in those terrible situations. Now, for Fields, he just happens to have now sort of a second season of, on paper, not a great situation around him, as opposed to just the first season and not making as much step around him from year one to year two. But I don't think that's some sort of like omen that if Fields doesn't get out of if Fields doesn't get out of Chicago now, he's doomed to never be good. Because I think the Bears can be a year away from having a really good supporting cast around him by year 3, and maybe that's not ideal by any means. But like, it doesn't seem like it's like he's doomed or ruined or any of that stuff. So it just feels like it falls. The logic there falls through just a little bit when you start poking too much into it, and that's kind of where a lot of this goes. I think there's even less logic in the take we heard from Mike Florio on 670 The Score about his theory about the Bears being sort of like ready to give up on Justin Fields. We'll kind of go through what he said and again sort of set the record a little more straight here next on Locked On Bears. Our friends at BetOnline.net are going to be your number one source for all of your sports betting stats and information. With the NFL Draft right around the corner, you can use your draft knowledge to lay down some cash and win big on how this first round is going to go. You can bet on who's going to be the number 1 overall pick, number 2 overall pick, how many wide receivers go in the first round, quarterbacks go in the first round, how many Georgia players, different schools, different positions. There's a bunch of different ways to slice and dice it with our friends at betonline.net for all the latest sports developments and league news, including the NBA playoffs underway now. You can bet on who's going to win the finals, plus Major League Baseball's underway, hockey season's winding down, plus soccer, hockey, tennis. I already said hockey, but you name it, they have it at BetOnline. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. I do feel a little bit bad putting putting bad Bears takes in front of you, but it's been too common here, and I really think it's important to kind of poke some holes in it and make sure that we all understand like why this is bad and why it's wrong, and as to not to doubt or to question. You can have your doubts and questions about Justin Fields in general, but like that some of these things are just head scratchers. And I think the one from Mike Florio was the one that rubbed me the wrongest way, but just lacked the most logic. And Florio's quote from 670 Score, I'm not going to play the audio because I don't, permissions and all that stuff from being on the radio, but the quote was, quote, "There's a fine line between deliberately and strategically taking a step back and tanking." Florio said, "There's a fine line between those two things, but it feels like the Bears are deliberately taking a step back. And the problem is, usually teams do that when they don't have a quarterback they believe in, because part of the setup is we'll be so bad and we'll end up with a quarterback who becomes our franchise foundation. Maybe that's the hidden message here, that the new regime doesn't believe in Justin Fields. Because if they did, would they be tearing everything else down? Or would they be trying to build everything else up? Because what happens is, if the team stinks, Justin Fields is going to have a rough year, and fans will be like, well, we wasted a couple first-round picks on him, on to the next one. So maybe if there's truth to the idea, and it sure looks like it, that they're deliberately tearing everything down, it could be that this is just step one toward moving on from Justin Fields at the appropriate time, which could be as soon as next year if they would trade him to someone else and then begin their search for whoever the next franchise quarterback is going to be. Essentially postulating here, that's not really reporting, because there was a couple of maybes in there. There is it sort of looks like this, but postulating that the Bears don't believe in Justin Fields, and that's why they're going about the team building process the way that they are. And to me, it just seems like a fundamental misunderstanding. I don't think it's a misunderstanding. I think it's a lack of understanding. So like misunderstanding would imply that there was some understanding and it was just mixed up. But I think it's a lack of knowledge and information about the Chicago Bears roster situation, financial situation, draft capital, roster capital situation, where they are in this team building progress. Florio in this seems to be under the impression that if the Bears really wanted to, they could have somehow build everything else up around Justin Fields more than they have this offseason. And I guess I would just ask him how and where, in what ways would you suggest that they do that? Are you suggesting keeping Khalil Mack and trying to re-sign Allen Robinson and trying to re-sign James Daniels? I guess all of that would be just keeping the players from last year, which wouldn't even be building up. And then you would have exactly zero cap space left to sign anybody else. So you would have no defensive line, no offensive line. Well, you'd have Daniels, but no secondary, no other receivers. It would just be Robinson and Mooney. The reality of the Bears' salary cap situation this offseason was they had a bunch of free agents and some cap space and not a ton of draft capital and a bunch of holes to fill. I mean, when you look back at all the different positions that were free agents, remember Darnell Mooney and Daz Newsome were your only wide receivers under contract. You didn't really have a guard or center super locked in. I mean, Sam Mustipher sort of back as an exclusive rights free agent, but you needed you still need more on the offensive line. You didn't. I mean, yes, they released Eddie Goldman and Akeem Hicks. But again, if you had signed if you had kept those players, they didn't release Akeem Hicks, but they released Eddie Goldman and they didn't bring back Akeem Hicks. But if you bring in those players, you don't have money for the wide receivers, right? It's not like the Bears were sitting here and said, you know what? Let's intentionally sign a cheap defensive end and a cheap defensive tackle and a cheap center and 2 cheap wide receivers. Because you know what? We just want to pocket the money. You know what I mean? It's not like they're going out there and intentionally not getting the best players they can. It's just the reality of their salary cap and draft capital situation. They can't afford to sign big, expensive free agents to build around Fields. And that's part of why they put so much of their savings in the future in terms of trading Khalil Mack and moving on from some of the players they did to free up more future cap space, because he looked at the books and said, hey, we barely have enough money to fill the spots on our roster right now, let alone add premier talents. And when I'm looking ahead to next year, we're still not going to have any money to do that. So we have to trade Khalil Mack. We have to move on from Eddie Goldman. We have to move around wherever we can find the money because we're not going to have the money next year either. And so they have to take their lumps now. They're sitting on a small amount of salary cap space left. It's not like it's not like there's this money that they just chose not to spend. So I don't know what Florio would want the Bears to do to somehow like prove more of a building around Justin Fields. And it's just it's disjointed to say that the way they've gone about this rebuild that seems very necessary is somehow a referendum on how they feel about Justin Fields. I would say, to his credit, dare I say, like, this Bears regime is not necessarily locked into Justin Fields for the long term, right? Like, if Justin Fields is bad this season and bad next season, this regime didn't draft him, and they're not like, it's not like a Ryan Pace situation where like he'll hold on to him to really sort of make his draft thing come through. But they're absolutely going to recognize Justin Fields as an asset worth developing, and they're going to give Justin Fields every opportunity to succeed, just like they're going to do with any other player on the roster. And if over time he proves to be something great, then they will keep him and pay him and do all that. And if he proves to not be, then they'll move on the same way they would from any other player. But to suggest that already the regime doesn't believe in him, I think they've been very clear on the front end that like they're going to give all these guys a clean slate, right? The decisions they made to move on from Goldman and Hicks and Daniels and whoever, like so much of that was just financial. It wasn't, some of it's obviously tape based, whether you want to re-sign certain free agents or not. Like there's an on-field aspect of it, but like so much more of these decisions have been financially based and not just saying like, oh, we don't believe in Khalil Mack, so we're going to trade him, or like we don't believe in Allen Robinson, so we're not going to re-sign him. That's just not, that hasn't been part of the equation here. And instead it's just been a different approach to building the team. And honestly, you could say that this, like spending more money on free agents, because that's the only, like free agents to trade is the only thing the Bears have had the opportunity to do right so far before the draft, right? To build around Fields. So so you can say that like, you could see the other side of the coin where if the Bears had spent a bunch of free agent money, they'd get criticized. You could get criticized the same way the Jaguars do, where they're just throwing money and it's like, well, these free agents aren't going to work. And spending in free agency doesn't really equate always to more success on the field, at least sustained success on the field. So there's just not really any sort of connected logic between, okay, the Bears are doing a rebuild, but the rebuild means they don't believe in Fields because they just didn't have really great opportunities to invest significantly more in Fields. They could have put more of the money towards the offense than the defense, right? There's ways to tweak this, right? You could have financially in free agency taken some of the money that you've put to the defensive line and gotten slightly more expensive offensive players and slightly less expensive defensive players. But it's not like they put 25, 30 million on the defense and peanuts on the offense, right? They've had to go kind of cheap and low for the most part all around because that's the financial situation that Ryan Pace and company left them in to have to try and tear down and now rebuild. And it's just bad take from Mike Florio. But I think, I don't know, is that the worst take of the three? I guess I can't, it's hard to rate the terribleness of take because the last one we're going to get to here was very much just like a shot on Justin Fields as a person and from a media personality that's clearly just going after a need for attention. So we'll kind of set the record straight on Fields the human, which I think is probably a worse take because it's Florio lacks logic, but this one's just more being a jerk. But we'll kind of break that down next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars ever made, Built Bars. They really are something special. I haven't had another protein bar product like it anywhere else because Built Bars are the best of both worlds. They taste like candy bars. They're soft. They're easy to chew. They're covered in 100% real chocolate, and they're delicious. But Built Bars are also really good for you. Every Built Bar is low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. You cannot find that anywhere else in any of the other products. And they come in a bunch of delicious flavors. I promise you can find one you'll like or love the way I do. They just have these brownie batter built puffs. They're kind of like chocolate covered marshmallows, but it tastes like it's so rich and fudgy. And I just demolished the box of those that I had. They have so many other great flavors for any kind of palate. Built Bar is made for you. Head on over to built.com. Use our promo code LOCKED15 and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Our last bad Bears take today isn't as national of a media. I mean, it's a national media organization, but the person within it is, I had never heard of him before this. I'd heard of the organization he works for, and I'm intentionally not going to name them here, but I think you can, if you've followed some of the Justin Fields drama and the sort of one-sided feud this particular member of an unsavory media company was trying to generate on his own on social media with Justin Fields, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about. But he's very clearly a guy and generally a company that just wants attention. It's clickbait, it's getting people mad on Twitter, it's getting the mob and all that stuff, and it works. He tweeted out that his tweet about Fields got like 7 million impressions, and he got the last laugh there, which is, again, I'm not trying to give him the direct attention he deserves, but it's worth calling out bullcrap when we see it. So he put a little video on Twitter and said that he had been at some event somewhere in like New Jersey or Pittsburgh or something. I don't remember where it is. And he saw Justin Fields there and asked him for a picture. And this guy claims that Justin Fields rolled his eyes and said, sure, I guess, and took a picture with him. And so this guy went on Twitter afterwards and said Justin Fields is a punk, he's disrespectful, not humble at all, called him a bottom-of-the-barrel type guy, that Bears fans should be ashamed to call this guy your quarterback, a bad guy all the way around. And I just can't think of something that's like a more distant description of Justin Fields based on everything else we've seen and know about this kid, through the draft process and all that stuff. Like, like when there was that Bears fan, was it last year or the first year of the was it 2020 or 2021? There was a Bears fan who got shot and then said like he didn't want to die before seeing Justin Fields take the field. Like Justin Fields then went and visited him in the hospital. Justin Fields at training camp was very gracious with all the fans, taking pictures, signing autographs, and all this stuff. And he's always out at events and sporting events, and he's meeting with fans and hanging out. I mean, of course, the dude wants his privacy sometimes. Like he's not giving himself up all the time, but like he does charity work, and he's just. I mean, we've all seen who Justin Fields is from the moment the Bears drafted him. And even, the sort of the feeling at Ohio State was very similar. Like he was there, he was just at the Ohio State spring game, I think, last week, and he's signing autographs for the fans in the crowd. You know what I mean? And he's putting out statements about Dwayne Haskins and what he meant to him. Like he does all the things. And like, sure, we don't know what Justin Fields is like in his private life, but he's not a troublemaker. He's not, he just seems like a real like down-to-earth guy that everybody really likes. And so this one a-hole that works for an a-hole company that wanted a picture with a quarterback for a team that he's not even a fan of. Maybe Justin didn't really want to deal with his crap, but did it anyway. I mean, like, but because Justin Fields didn't give him the like love him, didn't, I don't know, say, oh yeah, like be best friends with him. I don't know what he wanted. I mean, I don't know exactly what he wanted Justin Fields to do, but it just seems pretty rich coming from this guy working for this company to call someone a bottom-of-the-barrel type guy, a bad dude, and disrespectful when he works for a company that is known for sexualizing and harassing women as like a mainstay of the company, not just like one-off actions here and there, but like encouraging their readers and followers to harass women and like doxing female reporters and like putting out their home phone numbers and then sending harassing calls and voicemails to these female reporters that report anything bad about this company, or like calling them at home, calling them at their workplace, getting after them. Like this company wallows just in viral clickbait. They're known for putting out racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic content. It's happened well documented over the years how generally terrible so many parts of this organization are, namely with their founder and CEO, who's currently being accused of sexual misconduct and violence against women and continues to sort of rally the troops around them. Like this is an organization that he works for and contributes to and is a part of these bad things that's horribly offensive and harmful to pretty much every group in society except for like straight white men, which is like the only group that they really care to appeal to. And many of their followers sort of end up in that same sort of ecosystem of just hating everything different from what they are. So for me, it starts at the top and it goes down the chain within that organization to everyone that works there, enabling that company culture that is harmful and toxic to so many people except themselves. And so for that guy from that company who plays up those offensive, horrible things that this company has done, to come out and call Justin Fields the disrespectful punk who's a bottom of the barrel type guy is very much pot calling the kettle black, and he should probably look in the mirror and realize who he's describing and what he's talking about. So it's no surprise this guy is just a-hole attention whore that just wants your clicks and your anger. And I guess he sort of got some of the anger from me, but I didn't use his name and I didn't say his company by name. So if you don't know who he is, good. That's the thing. That's at the end of the day, that's how it is for me. It's like, if you know who he is, good. If you don't know who he is, even better, because it's a waste of internet space. And I hope we can all just sort of ignore him and move on from these bad sort of national, regional media Bears takes and kind of get on with, hey, like the NFL draft and team building and team, and kind of let things actually happen instead of like hypothesizing that the Bears are ready to move on from Justin Fields, or that Fields should be allowed to demand a trade, or that he's somehow a bad guy. It's all garbage. I mean, it's varying degrees of garbage, different types of garbage, but any way you slice it, it still belongs to the dumpster. And so we had to properly put it in the dumpster and take out the trash on the podcast today. We'll get back to more of like draft coverage, any free agency updates, and everything else all throughout the rest of the week and the offseason here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So I hope that you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, the Locked On NFL Draft podcast has you covered all draft season long, getting you ready with Mock Draft Monday today. Plus, I mean, they're breaking out prospects any and all the time. Plus, the week of the draft, we're going to do an ultimate mock draft, including the Bears' the first second-round pick for the Bears, which I am making the selection for. We'll kind of go a whole week-long NFL draft special. And then during the draft itself, we will be live all 3 days of the draft on the Locked On NFL YouTube channel, and I'll be chiming in for the Bears pick live as part of that stream. It'll be a whole bunch of fun. So lots of great draft content coming your way in the very near future. In the meantime, I hope you'll keep tuning in, keep coming back for more, and most importantly, I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it just a little bit easier for you to bear down.